3 Roman legions disappeared into a forest and never came out. 20,000 soldiers swallowed whole by trees, mud, and rain, not defeated in open battle, but erased, methodically, over 4 days of confusion and terror. The Roman Empire never forgot it. They retired the legion numbers forever. They built walls instead of roads. And the man who led them there, Publius Quinctilius Varus, became a name spoken only in whispers of warning. September 9 AD, Germania. A place Rome believed it owned but had never truly understood. For decades, Roman legions had marched across continents with terrifying efficiency. Gaul had fallen. Britannia was being subdued. Spain, North Africa, the Middle East, all absorbed into an empire that seemed destined to consume the known world. Germania was supposed to be next. The land east of the Rhine River was wild, forested, and sparsely populated, but Rome had declared it a province anyway. They built forts. They collected taxes. They appointed a governor. On paper, Germania belonged to Rome. But forests don't care about paper. The Roman approach to conquest was methodical. First came the legions. Then came the roads, the forts, the bureaucrats, the merchants. Roman culture followed Roman swords. Within a generation, conquered peoples would speak Latin, wear togas, and worship Roman gods. It had worked everywhere else. Why would Germania be different? Because Germania wasn't a kingdom with a capital to capture or a king to negotiate with. It was a patchwork of tribes scattered across endless woodlands and marshes. The Cherusci, the Marsi, the Chatti, the Bructeri. Dozens of groups who fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Rome saw this fragmentation as weakness. It was actually camouflage. By 9 AD, Rome had been operating in Germania for nearly 2 decades. Forts lined the Rhine. Patrols moved through tribal territories. The Emperor Augustus believed the region was pacified enough to begin the next phase, turning barbarians into Romans. He needed someone to oversee this transformation, someone experienced in governance, someone who could manage taxation, legal systems, and cultural integration. He chose Publius Quinctilius Varus. Varus was not a soldier by training. He was an administrator, a politician. He'd governed Syria successfully, though his methods there had been brutal. High taxes, harsh punishments, mass crucifixions after unrest in Judea. But Syria had been conquered territory, and the locals had no choice but to comply. Varus approached Germania with the same mindset. He saw tribes who needed civilizing, not enemies who needed defeating. His appointment revealed a fundamental Roman miscalculation. They believed Germania was already won. The fighting was over. All that remained was paperwork. Varus arrived in Germania with 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. Each legion contained roughly 5,000 professional soldiers, supported by auxiliary cavalry and light infantry. Add in camp followers, servants, merchants, families, and the columns swelled to over 20,000 people. It was a city on the move, complete with supply wagons, siege equipment, and enough bureaucratic apparatus to run a province. Varus set up his main camp near modern-day Xanten along the Rhine. From there, he conducted what he believed was routine governance, settling disputes, collecting tribute, issuing decrees. The tribes sent representatives, they paid taxes, they smiled and nodded. Everything appeared calm. But appearances in Germania were deliberately constructed. Among the tribal representatives was a young Cheruscan noble named Arminius. His father, Segima, was a powerful chieftain who had chosen cooperation with Rome over resistance. As part of that cooperation, Arminius and his brother Flavus had been sent to Rome as hostages years earlier. It was standard Roman practice. Take the sons of tribal leaders, raise them in Roman culture, give them citizenship and military training, then send them back as loyal intermediaries. Arminius had excelled. He learned Latin fluently. He studied Roman military tactics. He commanded auxiliary cavalry units. He earned Roman citizenship and the rank of equestrian, a mark of significant status. To Varus and other Roman officials, Arminius was proof that Romanization worked. Here was a Germanic prince who had become more Roman than barbarian. They never considered that he might be both. Arminius understood something Rome didn't. Germania would never be a province like Syria or Gaul. The tribes would never accept permanent occupation. They would smile, pay token tribute, and wait. Wait for the right moment. Wait for the right leader. Wait for Rome to make a mistake. In September of 9 AD, Arminius gave them that moment. The summer campaign season was ending. Varus prepared to move his 3 legions from their summer positions back to winter quarters along the Rhine. It was routine. The legions would march west, following established roads, and settle into fortified camps until spring. There was no expectation of combat. This was administrative movement, not military maneuvering. Then Arminius arrived with urgent news. A rebellion had broken out among tribes to the north. Nothing major, he assured Varus, but it needed Roman attention. A show of force, some arrests, standard suppression. Arminius even offered to guide the legions there personally. He knew the terrain, he knew the tribes, he knew exactly where the Romans needed to go. Another tribal leader, Segestes, warned Varus not to trust Arminius. He claimed Arminius was planning treachery. He urged Varus to arrest the Cheruscan prince immediately. But Segestes and Arminius were rivals. Segestes' daughter was married to Arminius against her father's wishes. To Varus, this looked like a family dispute, not a military warning. Varus trusted Arminius. Why wouldn't he? The man was a Roman citizen. He'd fought alongside legionaries for years. He'd never shown disloyalty. And the story made sense. Minor rebellions happened constantly in frontier provinces. A quick march, a brief show of force, and the problem would disappear. So Varus changed his route. Instead of taking the direct road west to the Rhine, he ordered his legions to march north into the interior forests to deal with Arminius's rebellion. There was no rebellion. There never had been. What waited in those forests was something the Roman military machine had never encountered before. Not an army to fight, but a landscape that made fighting impossible. Not a battle, but a trap that would take 4 days to close. Not a defeat, but an annihilation so complete that Rome would abandon an entire frontier rather than risk it happening again. The legions marched off the main roads and into narrow forest tracks. The columns stretched for miles, wagons slowed movement, trees pressed in from both sides. And Arminius, riding at the front with Varus, knew exactly where every hidden ditch had been dug, every tree had been felled, every warrior was waiting in the shadows. The forest was about to teach Rome a lesson it would never forget. The columns stretched across the landscape like a wounded serpent, 9 miles from head to tail, maybe longer. Nobody could see the full length anymore. What had started as an organized march on proper roads had become something else entirely. A slow crawl through terrain that seemed designed to punish Roman efficiency. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. 12,000 legionaries, plus another 4,000 auxiliary troops. Add the cavalry squadrons, the camp followers, the merchants who trailed every army, the wives who weren't supposed to be there but always were, the children, the servants. 20,000 people, maybe more, moving through forests that pressed in from both sides like the walls of a trap. This wasn't how Roman armies traveled. Legions marched in tight formation, columns that could deploy into battle lines within minutes. Standards flying, each cohort knowing its position, cavalry screening the flanks. Order, control, the visible expression of Roman power. But here, the wagons slowed everything. The forest paths were too narrow for proper formations. Trees forced the column to thin out, stretching it until legionaries couldn't see the men ahead or behind. And then the rain started. Not a brief shower, a torrential downpour that turned the forest floor into soup. Mud grabbed at boots and wagon wheels. Horses stumbled. Equipment that weighed nothing in the dry camps along the Rhine suddenly felt like lead. Shields absorbed water and grew heavy. Leather straps stretched. Metal armor became slick and awkward. The legionaries kept moving because that's what legionaries did. They'd marched across deserts, through mountain passes, in snow and heat and every condition between. This was just weather, just terrain. Nothing they hadn't handled before. Except they had never handled this before. Not really. Not this combination of factors all hitting at once. The forest was different from open battlefields. The rain was making everything harder, and the path ahead kept twisting, turning, leading them deeper into landscape where everything Roman doctrine taught them about warfare stopped applying. Varus rode near the front, probably reviewing maps that were increasingly useless. The rebellion they were marching to suppress lay somewhere ahead. Arminius assured him they were taking the most direct route. A few more days, and they'd reach the tribal settlements, make the necessary arrests, remind everyone who held power here. What Varus didn't know, what he couldn't know from his position at the column's head, was that behind him the formation was disintegrating. Wagons bogged down in mud, creating bottlenecks. Units separated by terrain lost contact with each other. The column stopped being an army and became a series of isolated groups, each focused on the immediate problem of moving forward through impossible conditions. The Germanic auxiliaries who'd been marching with the Romans began disappearing. Not all at once, a few riders here, a squad there. They knew these forests. They had cousins in these tribes, and they'd been told what was coming, because Arminius hadn't spent the previous weeks idle. While Varus planned his march, Arminius had been preparing something else entirely. The rebellion was fiction. The route was deliberate. And every Germanic warrior within a day's march knew exactly where the Romans would be and when they'd arrive. The forest itself had been weaponized. Trees felled across paths, forcing the column into predetermined routes. Ditches dug where Romans would need to cross. Earthworks built on ridges, overlooking narrow passages. Not fortifications in the Roman sense, just low walls and fighting positions, concealed by trees and undergrowth, invisible until you were already in the killing zone. Arminius had learned Roman tactics in Roman camps. He knew how legions deployed, how they fought, what made them effective. And he knew the one thing that could neutralize all of it: take away their ability to form up, keep them stretched thin, hit them where they couldn't use their training, their discipline, their superior equipment. The forests near Calcrease Hill provided exactly that opportunity. On one side, a massive bog that no army could cross. On the other, rising ground covered in trees. Between them, a passage barely wide enough for the Roman column. Once they entered that corridor, there was no deploying, no maneuvering, no falling back to defensible positions. You entered, or you turned around. And turning around meant admitting the mission was impossible, that the forest had beaten you before any enemy appeared. The first attacks came from nowhere. One moment, the column was slogging through mud and rain. The next, javelins were raining down from the ridge. Not a full assault, just enough to kill a few men, wound others, create confusion. Then silence. The Germans melted back into the trees before anyone could respond. Roman officers shouted orders: form up, prepare for contact. But forming up required space and solid ground. The column had neither. Legionaries raised shields, protecting themselves from above, but that made moving forward even harder. And the attacks kept coming. Different positions, different angles, always from cover, always from elevation. This was guerrilla warfare before anyone called it that. Hit and run, strike and vanish. Never give the enemy a target they can engage. Never commit to a fight you might lose. Just bleed them, slow them, make every mile cost blood. The Romans tried to respond with their own tactics: deploy archers, clear the ridges. But the rain had made bowstrings useless, and clearing ridges meant leaving the path, climbing slopes in full armor, chasing enemies who knew every tree and trail. Men sent to pursue the Germans often didn't come back. As darkness approached on the first day, Varus ordered the column to make camp, standard procedure, build fortifications, post guards, weather the night, and resume the march tomorrow. But building a fortified camp required level ground and time. The forest gave them neither. They dug what trenches they could, raised what walls were possible, and waited for dawn. The Germans didn't attack the camp. Why would they? The Romans were already trapped, already exhausted, already losing the psychological battle. Every hour in these forests made legionaries realize their training wasn't enough, their equipment wasn't enough, their confidence wasn't enough. Morning brought more rain, more attacks, more losses. The column tried to move forward because going back seemed impossible. The Germans controlled the rear now. They'd closed the trap behind the Romans, cutting off retreat. So Varus pushed ahead, hoping to break through, to reach open ground where legions could be legions again. They never reached it. The forest just kept going. The attacks intensified, and slowly, the realization settled over the Roman ranks. This wasn't a march anymore. This was survival. And survival was looking less likely with every passing hour. The greatest military machine the world had ever seen was being dismantled piece by warriors who refused to fight the way Rome expected. By the second night, discipline began to fracture. Soldiers abandoned wagons they'd been ordered to protect. Equipment that should never leave a legionary's side was tossed into the mud. Helmets, shields, even swords. The logic was brutal. Move faster, or die tired. The Germans weren't just attacking anymore. They were hunting. Small groups of legionaries who strayed from the main column vanished without a trace. Sometimes their screams echoed through the trees. Sometimes there was only silence. Worse were the ones found later, bodies arranged deliberately where Romans would see them, messages written in flesh. The psychological warfare was surgical. Every corpse reminded the survivors that the forest belonged to someone else. Varus still believed the situation could be salvaged. His training told him that Roman discipline always prevailed. His experience in Syria had taught him that rebellions collapsed once you killed enough rebels. But Syria had open ground and visible enemies. This forest gave him neither. Officers tried maintaining order by executing deserters. The execution stopped when it became clear that more men were dying to German ambushes than to Roman justice. Priorities shifted. Stay alive first. Maintain discipline second. The column's shape changed as it moved deeper into the trap. The front pushed ahead desperately, hoping to break through to open ground. The rear guard fought constant skirmishes, trying to prevent encirclement. The middle just struggled to keep moving, crushed between the two extremes. Communication between sections broke down completely. Runners sent forward didn't return. Messages shouted backward were lost in the rain and chaos. Each part of the column made its own decisions, and those decisions were increasingly about immediate survival rather than coordinated strategy. Germanic tactics evolved as Roman strength degraded. Early attacks had been cautious probes, testing Roman responses and weaknesses. Now, the Germans attacked with confidence, sometimes even engaging in brief hand-to-hand combat before withdrawing. They'd learned which parts of the column were weakest, where the baggage train slowed movement, where exhausted legionaries had given up maintaining defensive postures. The attacks came at those precise points, maximizing damage while minimizing risk. Think about what happens when a predator realizes its prey is wounded. The attacks become bolder, more frequent. Arminius understood Roman military doctrine better than most Romans. He knew legions depended on mutual support, on units reinforcing each other, on cavalry providing reconnaissance and flanking protection. The forest had stripped all of that away. Now he was watching Rome's military machine disintegrate according to principles Rome itself had taught him. The third day began with a discovery that shattered what remained of Roman morale. Scouts sent ahead the previous evening were found crucified on trees, their bodies displayed where the column would pass. It wasn't just brutality, it was calculation. The Germans wanted Romans to see what awaited capture, wanted them to understand that surrender wasn't an option. Fear is a weapon that requires no sharpening. Varus ordered a final push toward high ground visible through the trees. If they could reach that elevation, they might establish a defendable position, might force the Germans into a direct assault where Roman heavy infantry still held advantages, might buy time for rescue forces that weren't coming. The column surged forward with desperation replacing discipline. Men climbed over fallen comrades, pushed aside the wounded who couldn't keep pace. Survival instinct had fully replaced military order. They never reached the high ground. The Germans had prepared their final trap with methodical precision. Earthworks had been constructed across the only viable path, hidden behind trees and undergrowth. Trenches dug where Romans would naturally funnel. Defensive positions built to withstand the last desperate charge of a dying army. When the front ranks of the column hit these fortifications, the advance didn't just stop. It collapsed backward onto itself. What followed wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. The remaining Romans were compressed into a killing zone where German warriors attacked from elevated positions with complete impunity. Javelins fell in waves. Stones, launched from slings, cracked skulls and shattered bones. Individual Germans descended from the earthworks to finish wounded Romans who couldn't defend themselves. The massacre was systematic, thorough, and utterly one-sided. Some legionaries tried forming defensive circles, the last-ditch tactic for surrounded troops. These formations held briefly before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and exhaustion. Others attempted breakout charges, hoping to punch through German lines and escape into the forest. None succeeded. The Germans had positioned reserves specifically to intercept such attempts. Every Roman response had been anticipated and countered. Varus watched his command disintegrate from a position near the center of what remained of the column. He was surrounded by his senior officers, men who'd served Rome for decades, who'd commanded legions across the empire. They understood what was happening, understood that no rescue was coming, understood that within hours, 3 entire legions would cease to exist. The conversation they had was brief. Then Varus drew his sword, placed the point against his chest, and fell forward. His officers followed within moments. They chose Roman suicide over Germanic capture, maintaining at least that final shred of dignity. News of Varus's death spread through the surviving Romans rapidly. For some, it released them from the obligation to keep fighting. They dropped weapons and waited for the end. For others, it triggered a final rage-fueled resistance. These men fought with the fury of those who know they're already dead, making the Germans pay for every step forward. Neither response changed the outcome. By nightfall on the 3rd day, organized Roman resistance had ended. Small groups of survivors scattered into the forest, hoping to evade German patrols and somehow reach the Rhine. Most didn't make it. The Germanic tribes spent the following days systematically hunting survivors. The forest that had hidden their ambushes now concealed Roman fugitives, but the Germans knew every trail, every stream, every cave where desperate men might hide. Captured Romans faced varied fates. Common soldiers were often killed immediately. Officers were reserved for ritual sacrifice, their deaths offerings to Germanic gods. A few were kept alive as slaves or hostages, though most of these would die from wounds or exposure before reaching Germanic settlements. Arminius ordered the battlefield to be left as it fell. Roman equipment scattered across miles of forest, bodies left unburied as warnings to any future Roman expeditions. The message was clear and deliberate. This land belongs to us, and Rome's legions are not invincible. 3 eagle standards, the sacred symbols of Roman legionary honor, were captured and displayed as trophies. Their loss was a humiliation that would haunt Rome for generations. A handful of Romans did reach the Rhine. Their accounts reached Roman commanders within days, spreading panic through Rhine garrisons. These survivors described an enemy that fought unlike anything Rome had encountered before. An enemy that had turned Rome's own tactics against it, that had transformed favorable terrain into an execution ground, that had destroyed 3 legions without ever fighting the pitched battle Roman training prepared for. Back in Rome, Augustus was reportedly devastated when news arrived. The loss of 3 legions represented more than a military defeat. It was a fundamental challenge to Roman invincibility. Augustus reportedly paced the palace corridors for days, refusing food, refusing sleep. His grief transformed into something darker. He stopped trimming his hair and beard, ancient Roman signs of mourning. But what haunted him most wasn't grief. It was the question that had no answer. How? Rome had conquered Gaul, Spain, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean. Its legions had faced Carthaginians, Macedonians, Parthians. None had inflicted damage like this, not in a siege, not in a pitched battle, but in a forest where Roman discipline meant nothing. The Senate held emergency sessions. Panic spread through the Rhine garrisons. If 3 legions could vanish in days, what prevented Germanic tribes from crossing the river and invading Gaul? Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and Rome's most experienced general, was immediately dispatched to stabilize the frontier with reinforcements. Arminius didn't pursue his advantage. He understood something most victors miss. Rome's true strength wasn't its legions. It was its refusal to accept defeat as final. Crossing the Rhine would unite every Roman faction against Germania, turning regional conflict into total war. Instead, he dismantled every Roman fort and settlement east of the river, erasing decades of occupation in weeks. One fortress held out longer than expected. Aliso, garrisoned by survivors from the forest and commanded by Lucius Caedicius, withstood Germanic siege for months. The defenders knew reinforcements weren't coming, knew the empire had written them off, but they held anyway, buying time for Rhine defenses to organize. When they finally broke through Germanic lines and reached Roman territory, their survival became legendary. Not because it changed anything strategically, because it proved Romans could still defy the odds, even after everything had fallen apart. The psychological damage to Rome went deeper than troop losses. For generations, Roman military doctrine had emphasized discipline, formation fighting, engineering superiority. Teutoburg Forest invalidated all of it. The legions hadn't been outfought in honest battle. They'd been rendered irrelevant by terrain that made their training worthless. Roman military academies began studying what went wrong, not to plan revenge immediately, but to understand how invincibility had shattered so completely. The conclusions were uncomfortable. Roman tactics worked brilliantly on open ground, in forests, marshes, mountains, against enemies who refused conventional battle. Those same tactics became liabilities. The empire's strength was also its weakness. 5 years passed before Rome attempted serious retaliation. Germanicus, nephew of Emperor Tiberius, led multiple campaigns into Germania between 14 and 16 AD. His forces numbered up to 70,000 men, supported by naval logistics. This wasn't about conquest anymore. This was about recovering honor. Germanicus located the Teutoburg battlefield in 15 AD. What his soldiers found disturbed them profoundly. Bones scattered across miles of forest. Armor rusted into the mud. Skulls mounted on trees as offerings to Germanic gods. The remains of 3 entire legions left to rot as deliberate warnings. Germanicus ordered mass burials, proper Roman rites for men who died without them. He also recovered one of the lost eagle standards from the Marsi tribe. The following year, another eagle was taken from the Bructeri. These weren't just military trophies. They were sacred symbols of Roman honor. Their recovery mattered more than territory gained or enemies killed. Rome needed proof it could take back what Germania had stolen. But the campaigns achieved nothing permanent. Germanic tribes avoided pitched battles, melting into forests whenever Roman columns approached. Supply lines stretched impossibly long. Casualties mounted from ambush, disease, exhaustion. By 16 AD, Tiberius ordered withdrawal. Not because Rome couldn't field more troops, because the cost of holding Germania exceeded any possible benefit. The Rhine became the permanent frontier. East of the river remained unconquered, a stark reminder that Rome's expansion had limits. The lost legions were never reconstituted. 17, 18, and 19 simply ceased to exist. No other defeated legions received this treatment. Their numbers were retired, as if speaking them might invoke the curse that had destroyed them. Arminius didn't live long enough to see his victory's full impact. Germanic tribal politics turned poisonous. His success made him dangerous to other chiefs who feared his growing power. In 21 AD, he was assassinated by his own relatives during a tribal dispute. He died at 37, having changed European history before most generals even received their first command. His legacy remained complicated. To Romans, he was the ultimate traitor, a man who'd accepted citizenship and military training only to use both against his benefactors. To Germanic tribes, he was simultaneously a hero and a cautionary tale about trusting anyone who'd spent too much time in Roman company. Centuries later, German nationalists would claim him as their founding father. The reality was messier than any myth could capture. The third eagle standard wasn't recovered until 41 AD, during Emperor Claudius's reign. 32 years after the battle, Publius Gabinius retrieved it from a tribe that had kept it as a sacred object. Its return closed a chapter Rome had tried desperately to forget. Teutoburg Forest changed how Rome approached its borders. The empire stopped assuming expansion was inevitable. Augustus's final advice to Tiberius was explicit: keep the empire within its current boundaries. Don't seek new conquests. The trauma of losing 3 legions in a forest had fundamentally altered Roman strategic thinking. The battle also demonstrated something about military power that empires consistently forget. Overwhelming force means nothing if you can't apply it effectively. Rome had more troops, better equipment, superior logistics, professional training. None of it mattered when the battlefield itself negated every advantage. Arminius understood that controlling where and how you fight matters more than controlling how many soldiers you bring. 3 legions marched into those trees believing in their invincibility. What emerged was a lesson written in blood and mud that would echo across 2 millennia. The forest didn't just defeat Rome, it redrew the map of Europe, established a boundary that would shape nations yet unborn, and demonstrated that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't steel or strategy, but simply knowing where to make your stand.